Hi, my name is Jacqueline. As with most any human being, during my 48 years of life, I have taken on many titles. Positive titles like daughter, mother, friend, student, and negative titles like pretty, fat, half-breed, and junkie. I have come here to this place and time in my life, having outlived the oppression and pressures of most all of these titles, because today I stand here with the title of Grateful Believer in Jesus Christ. And this is my testimony. Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. Mark 5:19. My mother, who was born of a conservative Kentucky Baptist family, married her first husband straight out of college. He was a terribly abusive alcoholic who beat her frequently. She gave birth to my brother, and after several abusive years, divorced her husband and began to raise my brother alone. He is 11 years my senior. My mother later remarried a shoe salesman who was the deacon of his church and an aspiring musician. I was born of that marriage in 1969 in Colorado. My mother and father split up directly after my birth, leaving my mother to raise her two children primarily alone. My mother has always been incredibly self-sufficient and remains today one of the smartest persons I have ever known. I credit her for giving me the opportunities to chase my childhood dreams, like becoming a famous pianist, and for giving me the aptitude for communication, though I find this story a struggle to tell. When I was born, the country was still gripped by racism and anger. Because my mother married a black man, there were things in the world unavailable to them, to us, including what I would call decent habitation. I was born into an all-black neighborhood to a white mother, and I was not colored to the degree that one might call either black or white. I was to the outside world an abomination, too white for the black folks, too black for the white folks, but all the while, just a child who saw neither color as different or specifically special. At an early age, I began to receive terrible attention racially in the neighborhood we lived in. We were targets of hate crimes galore, as well as inside my family, where we were shunned by most all of my mother's family, who were all raised in the South. My mother worked 2 jobs to feed and house my brother and I, and was hindered by the inability to have her kids in the same daycares due to race and financial bias. During this time, starting about 2 to 3 years old, my biological father would watch me during the day. It was then when my uncle, my biological father's brother, molested me. He was already an adult, in his 20s, I believe. Because of his resemblance to my father, I grew up thinking that my father had molested me until about 10 years ago, when a half-sister had made me aware of the molestation as a child that she had from the same uncle. As my mother began to improve our circumstances, we moved and I began school. I showed extreme ability where learning was involved. I loved to read and write. I was most interested by science and music, and from the outside, life may have seemed okay. I began first grade being bused 25 miles away from my home to attend a school in a mixed race school district. I knew nothing of racial tension, though I lived in it daily. My mother tried to prepare me as best as she could for what may lie ahead for me racially as I got older, but at 5 years old, I still saw no difference in me and others. And he said to them, "You yourselves know how unlawful it is for a man who is a Jew to associate with a foreigner or to visit him. And yet, God has shown me that I should not call any man unholy or unclean." Acts 10:28. During kindergarten and first grade, my mother often left me alone with my brother, who was 11 years my senior, as I stated before. He began to molest me occasionally, and then somewhat frequently, and then daily. This didn't end until the middle of second grade. Also, by the middle of first grade, I was deemed extremely intelligent, but suffering with hyperactivity, which later became known as ADHD. Unfortunately, the school district that I was in had no processes in place to handle children with above average intelligence, and I was given the title of unmanageable. We did finally move from this place to a school district better suited for children with intelligence, one that had no color restrictions. I took the title of unmanageable with me. And because of this, I was given the opportunity to meet weekly with a school counselor who I loved dearly. She helped me to assimilate a bit better, but was always really curious as to what had caused me to be singled out as unmanageable. The fact that I was molested several times before the age of 6 and by several people of authority in my young life became apparent one day in her office while playing house on the floor. This realization sparked a destruction of my family unit as I knew it, as she had no choice but to tell the authorities, which led to the temporary removal of my brother, and sparked what I experienced as a newfound hatred for me from my mother. As my brother was taken from my home in a police car, my mother slapped me across the face and titled me homewrecker. About that time, I turned 7. My mother remarried, and now I also had a new father who had 2 sons of his own that became my new family of origin. It appeared as though I was finally going to be surrounded with love and support, and it was that way for a minute. But all the while, we kept ignoring and hiding deep, dark secrets that had come out earlier on that floor in that school counselor's office. I was a fairly popular child for reasons that weren't all normal. I was large for my age, both length and width, so I was very popular on the school grounds with the boys who played Smear the Queer and football with me daily. But because I had produced boobs, along with a low self-esteem, bad sexual image, and deep need for love, that I was de-shirted and de-pantsed on the playground and entered into sexual relationships with grown men, including my married neighbor who was a father of 4. I made very few girlfriends during this time, but the 3 that I did have, I thankfully still have to this day. I mostly stuck with boys and boy stuff growing up, until my teenage years when boys became interesting on a new level. Unfortunately, not a good level, as I had been growing a sick sense of self and sexuality due to my early unmanaged abuse. My middle school, high school years looked something like this. I became interested in modeling and even went to a fairly famous modeling school here in Denver. I also began competing in beauty pageants, boasting several successes. At the same time, by 12th grade's end, I was already a druggie. I was drinking and smoking pot, had done acid at least 20 times. I had done mushrooms, tried cocaine, and had already lost 2 friends to drugs and suicide. I had engaged in consensual sex a lot with many different partners. I had gotten pregnant 2 times, had 2 abortions, was brutally raped by a known neighborhood boy that I had invited into my house to drink from my parents' liquor cabinet after school one day, which was all completely drug out publicly in my family and in school, but was eventually dropped judicially for lack of compassion. So that prompted me to enter into another relationship with a teacher and another security guard, and also had my first same-sex relationship. I did not graduate from high school, but rather got my GED after realizing I wouldn't make 5 years positively. I decided to try for and was accepted to a junior college a bit too far from home. After 1 semester, I came home with about a $2,000 debt and about a 1.2 grade point average. The backstory there is that while I was dating a man from Denver, who I had gotten pregnant by a 3rd time, I was also sleeping with a kid in my dorm. When I had the abortion in town I went to school in, I was found out by everyone, and I mean everyone, as someone had posted my face on flyers all over campus. The boy I was sleeping with thought that I had aborted his kid and tried to commit suicide by jumping off the water tower on campus. He documented in a note that became the only reading done by anyone at school for the rest of the semester. I left that experience broken and ridiculed again. Know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. James 1:19-20. I returned to Aurora a failure and enrolled at community college where I thrived, seemingly. I excelled in class, became student government secretary, then president. During the 2 years that I attended, our little college moved from a small building to a sprawling campus, almost tripling in size and enrollment. During that time, I was given the opportunity to be the community liaison to the dean of college, which meant that I was on the board of everything during the change of campus, and I answered to the public, the media, and the college. I also made who's who of junior colleges that year. I graduated with honors and was shown on the course guide sent to thousands of potential students in our community twice. This is also where I ran into a man I knew in elementary school, whom I had had a crush on back then, but when I told him on the playground, he called me fat, sending me into a panic for days about being different. So I decided this time I was dating him, and I decided to marry him right after graduation, and I was going to ruin his life. So where it looked as though I was taking a hold of a brass ring in front of me, I was clearly not emotionally ready to entertain even so much as grass growing. It was right about now that my entire world changed, or so it seemed to people on the outside. But that's just because up to now, to them, I was beautiful, intelligent, driven girl who was a Miss Teen Colorado, played for the symphony, and excelled in all things. To them, it seemed like the world came crashing down unexpectedly and without reason when I got married after college to a man I didn't like. This relationship began on horrible terms. Regular arguing became serious physical abuse, culminating on a day after I had had my 4th abortion to avoid bringing another human into this hell, and resulted in me being taken to the hospital with a ruptured uterus, almost bleeding to death. About 3 months later, we sought marriage counseling because I found out I was pregnant yet again, and not being able to think of another abortion, I decided to keep the baby. During the pregnancy, he was found to be cheating on me with a family member and later the marriage counselor. And since we had absolutely no chance of relationship success, we split amicably a year and a half after we wed. Right about this time, I began doing cocaine to relieve the stress of a child, the overwhelming feeling of being fat after being scrutinized for so long for my looks, an ex-husband, an ex-mother-in-law, and a quickly fading youth. I proceeded through these years to work for some of the best companies in the world, really. Being a flight attendant even. I was even a Boy Scout troop leader. I moved a lot and told people that it was to accommodate my child, as he needed to be in the better school districts because he too had ADHD and was very intelligent, but it was also to facilitate an ever-growing cocaine addiction. I worked away from home constantly. I loved it. I drank too much, was never there for my son one-on-one, and had become a raging crack addict. Around that time, my son turned 6. I birthed another child with a man I literally met in a crack house. He was like a shiny new penny. We had chemistry that was just insane. Later, the entire relationship was insane, and we split, but not before I relinquished the full-time care of my son to his father, who quickly moved out of state with him. My daughter's father and I proceeded to become fully immersed in the crack scene until he abruptly moved to Texas, where he got clean and healthy, which left me to raise our child and my son off and on, alone, on crack. He faked me into believing that he was dying of cancer, so I allowed my daughter to go to Texas to visit for the summer, only for her to be kidnapped by her father and out of my life for another 9 years. This is about the same time I was reintroduced to the kid I had my very first crush on in middle school. We began a horrifically abusive relationship that saw the beginning of what would be my worst addiction ever. That was the addiction to shooting, meth, alcohol, anger, chaos. Yes, that is all one word. That word to me is junkie. Doing all these things, to me, seemed a normal reaction as I was left alone, navigating the landscape of my war-torn life. This man and I fought so badly. I stabbed him. He broke my eye socket, left me with permanent lifetime vision loss. It was because of the drugs and the life, the lack of money, the lack of purpose. It caused each of us to be in and out of the hospital or jail several times. I finally did get away from him, even stood up in court and watched them put this man in prison for his role in the abuse. This should have been a triumph, but it was more of a reason to fall deeper into hell, allowing me the freedom to pursue my addiction to shooting, meth, alcohol, anger, chaos. Because by this time in life, I had no hope. I was layered with these titles that had left my original title unrecognizable. About this time, I began working for my best friend and first roommate in earlier life. She owns a company cleaning new construction sites. It's her ministry. I worked it perfectly into my life of addiction, allowing me to dive deeper into despair and self-inflicted loneliness, comforted only by my, at that point, 3 to 4 shots a day addiction, all while drinking a fifth of vodka. Every day. Every day. But I was managing, or so I thought. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. Psalms 14:1. From here, my next few years looked like this. Remarried, conned. Unbeknownst to me, the con man was working on another out for himself, which suddenly left me homeless during the winter on the Denver streets. I met a new friend online who moved me to Texas to save me, but after trying to make me marry him, I returned to Denver and to the con man. But while I was in Texas, I had run into my daughter. After returning to my life in Colorado, my daughter had moved to Cheyenne, where she was at the top of her class and entering into her junior year in high school. Something happened that made her family move back to Texas, but she wanted to stay in Cheyenne. So I decided to become supermom. I took charge of our little broken family and moved my con man husband and I to Cheyenne to support her through the beginning of her adult life. But as my lousy decision-making skills would have it, I entered into a situation with my family that began looking like World War III, followed quickly by the zombie apocalypse. I again had been delusional. I eventually moved away from her, him, Cheyenne, and what I thought was sheer hell. I returned to Colorado, my job, my family home, and a crap ton of anger and alcohol and meth and my chaotic way of handling stuff. After several ridiculous life decisions, including having a boyfriend who was 6 years younger than my son, as well as a meth-addicted dealer, or moving in with another addict who was in complete denial, or finally breaking free of another boyfriend who had a serious affinity for meth, chaos, anger, and my underwear. And not that there is anything wrong with becoming the different you, it was just really bad timing for me. I realized that I was out of control, out of hope, and out of chances. My boss made me commit to attending a 12-step program with Celebrate Recovery, where I found some help in my trying times. I committed to the program in theory only. I went to class and I did the homework, and some things actually seemed better. But inside, I was just finished. And on New Year's Eve 2016, after trying to get anyone's attention, even posting it to social media, getting no response of any kind to help or stop me, I attempted suicide. I tried to kill me and my 3 dogs. And because of my method, there was absolutely no reason for any of us to live. But now I know that because of God, we all woke up the next morning to the wreckage that was my life. Each breath was such a labor, and I just couldn't go on this way anymore. Though I had been in CR for about 4 months to that point, I had not let it affect the psycho that was my life. I decided, because there was no one that showed, not one person around to save me, God must have shown up. Later that day, I fell to my knees and I begged God to forgive me and to help me pick up the pieces of this life. He immediately lifted me to my feet. He gave me the ability to take each breath one after another, and he stripped every single title away. He was not going to let me put the pieces of this life back together. They were not salvageable. In recovery, we talk about peeling away the layers of our onion. Well, God ripped them all away at once. He gave me a new life to navigate. He saved me. He gave me a new title, beloved. Because God had clearly shown up, I responded in kind. I had been in rehab before, but never Jesus-based and never successful. Though I still lost my job and my friends and my family and freedom, basically, during the next part of my journey, I gained my sobriety, my sanity, a deeper, more incredible love for the one and only Father who provided me a new life without meth, put me on a road that will see me recovered. I stopped being so dependent on others for help and looked to the one and only. He saves. But Jesus beheld them and said unto them, with men this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Matthew 19:26. As things get better in my life, you'll continue to find me struggling. I still fall. I work my program daily to overcome my addictions to anger, alcohol, but I am encouraged. I'm encouraged by God's grace and by the help of my sisters in recovery and my friends and my family, both new and old. I've become one of the top requested workers at my job, which is insanely amazing because that wasn't something that I could ever do before. Becoming responsible to my new life, it's mandatory. I've learned compassion. I'm open to the good things in the world. I have a positive outlook on life generally, and I am able to finally be the servant that God had always created me to be. I've had the opportunity to rekindle many lost relationships with my friends, including becoming a best friend again to the one girl that I credit my initial introduction to real recovery to. And for her, I'm blessed. So now, I wear the title of overcomer proudly. I realize that with God, I can overcome any boundary. And because of God, I have a purpose beyond all the titles I've ever carried or will ever carry. Because in Him, I am redeemed.
So I'll share.